Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to talk about single-page applications with our expert guest host, Gerry White. So we're used to being online and with our cell phone in hand, but we don't often think about what kind of technologies is helping us run this or that app. Usually, it's not a problem because we don't think about electricity, for example, when we turn on the lights. That makes sense. But if you're want to come to a decision about creating an app for your business, then it's conducive to understand what does SPA, single app application, means and how it is different from multi-page applications. So before I give the word over to our host and give a small introduction about our guest today, I just want to make sure that everyone can see and hear us. So find that chat and let us know where you guys are joining us from today. That would be a good indication that we are coming through. And let us know where you guys are joining us. My bad. Okay, let's see. There's a short delay, but I'm still hoping that people will respond and let us know that everything is fine on their end.
There we go. Harish from India.
Oh, great. Hello, Harish. Hello, Tucan Internet LLP. So I'm guessing that is a go ahead from the UK. Okay, thanks. Thanks for interacting with us at this stage. So before I give the word over to Gerry, I want to say a couple of words about Gerry. So he has been in the industry for over 20 years. He has a background in development. He transitioned to technical marketing, leading on SEO, analytics, and other digital growth strategies in companies, agencies, the government, and corporations such as the BBC. In the past few years, Gerry has spoken at conferences around the globe. He is a regular judge for awards such as the UK Search Awards, Growth Awards, and E-commerce Awards, and was the technical SEO lead for Just Eat, an FTSE company, 100 company in 12 markets, as well as consulting for other e-commerce brands. Actually, the first time I heard about Just Eat was during the European Cup, because we don't have that in my country. We don't have Just Eats, but it's now I know who was connected to it. So you guys can relax because we're gonna have a replay. So for now, just sit back and soak it all in. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them into the chat, and we will have a Q&A session at the very end. So without further ado, Gerry, take it away.
Okay, well, thanks for having us to start with. This kind of came about relatively recently because I had a conversation with a client of ours, and they basically said that they wanted to do a single page app, and they were basically told by other people that it's a nightmare for SEO, don't do it, it's a really bad idea. And I was like, but they're great, they're absolutely brilliant, you just have to do them right, you just have to do the testing, you have to do all sorts of bits and pieces, you just have to do things kind of right. I've kind of done a brief presentation. I say brief, there's about 100 slides, about 70 slides, but I'll whiz through them fairly quickly. And if anybody has any questions, that's what the comments is there for. So please feel free to fire as many questions in as possible. I actually see a friend of mine from Skip the Dishes is listening in as well. And I've got a lot of experiences because their website was very much built on this technology. So anybody in Canada listening in and seeing Skip the Dishes, that is very much where I've learned a lot of this stuff from. So, right, I'll see if I can share my screen. So bear with me and I'll see if I can get this working. Please work. Share screen, the right screen. Yeah, cool. Right, now, if any WhatsApp messages or anything embarrassing pops up, just ignore it, please. I'll try and figure out how to get this working. Okay, right, hopefully you can all see my screen, and I'm going to kick off. Okay, right, so single page apps, SPAs, PWAs, JavaScript, and SEO. Thanks to Search Engine Ranking for kind of letting me talk about this. So my name's Gerry White. I'm the SEO Director at Rise at 7. That is not my dog, but it's kind of a cool photo, so I just included it in. I do have a dog, It's kind of running around outside somewhere at the moment. So if you hear barking, apologies for that. I've tried to kind of keep it under control, but that's the problem with lockdown. I can't do this from an office quite as much as normal. The other thing I do is I organise an event called Take It Offline, which is now an international event. It was supposed to be in Bucharest in 2020, and that didn't go according to plan. But we've done some great events in Amsterdam, London, Brighton. There's going to be one in Paris soon, and there's going to be one in Israel soon. So keep your eyes open for this and all sorts of other bits and pieces. So what is a spa? Interestingly, one of my clients is actually a spa company. It does spa holidays, spa breaks, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to be talking about is, well, let's start with what a spa actually isn't. So classic website, classic web page, you've got a normal set of HTML, and then when you click on a link, it loads up a new page. And that is the way in which websites have been working for many, many years. Sometimes you have interactivity within a web page, which is JavaScript, but generally speaking, to navigate through a website, you click on the link, you go to the next page. Links look like that, so it's just an ahref, another page, and that's very much how it works. And Google can read this very comfortably, and it works very effectively for search engines. It then loads up all of that document back up again, including the content, including the links, everything that's needed to be in there. So it's kind of a bit inefficient if you're only changing 100 lines in the middle to load up the rest of the document. And whilst on this screen, it doesn't look that bad. If you take a look at Vodafone, for instance, it's actually 4,000 lines of the menus, of all sorts of images, of the footer, of basically all the lines that make up that website. That's 4,000 lines to be reloaded just for maybe 100 lines right in the middle. It just isn't an efficient way of doing it. There's also 138 other requests and 10 megabytes of files. This is kind of a heavy website now, so it is potentially worth looking at. Could they improve it, speed it up considerably by just saying, well, if you're only loading up a little bit in the middle, then only load up that little bit. So definitely an opportunity to make these things faster, and that's what a single page application can really do. So yeah, single page apps do this differently. When you interact, just the content that you need is pulled into the page. So if you're only loading up, changing maybe a video file, or you're loading up a tab or something in the page, it might want to change other elements around the page, but ultimately it just wants to change a little bit of content. So that's what it does. Google kind of call this the application shell model, and it sort of says you've got the application shell around the outside, and then the content gets dynamically pulled into it. And this is where single page apps effectively work. Good example is Gmail, Google Maps, YouTube, Netflix, and Tinder. If you've ever used the desktop version of Tinder or a mobile phone version of Tinder, it's actually using a very functional single page app. Now, one of the things I should mention, this is kind of a bad example. Tinder and Google Maps and Netflix, they don't necessarily want to be fully crawled in the same way that other sites do. So these are applications rather than necessarily kind of web pages. But one of the things that I have mentioned is the fact I used to work for Just Eat. And one of the big projects that I did towards the end was working on the new menu. And this does actually use a single page application technology. This actually only uses it on like the page itself. So what happens is if you kind of browse to a menu page, when you interact around the menu page, it doesn't want to reload everything. It just wants to reload either the information or the menu or whichever tab it is. So you see down the bottom of the screen there where it says menu or an information, those two bits are where it kind of matters. So this is like the Just Eat takeaway page, the information tab, and if I click over, it kind of clicks to the menu. What's interesting is the URL does change, even though it's not actually reloading the entire page. So this is a really good example of a simple single page application. And I'll circle back on this a few times, because actually this is kind of the fundamentally basic one that we've been using for so many other good examples. And I think this is a really good example of how you can do it. You don't have to do your entire website. You can do single page applications for elements such as product listing pages. You can do it for anywhere that basically you're interacting with the same page. You don't necessarily need it reloading. And it's just very effective, fast, and usable, user-friendly. This is a bit of the source code. And what you can see here is there's actually a true link ahref clause, which is readable by search engines. Without that, Google search engines wouldn't understand the relationship between the pages. So it is important these links are real, proper links. So why do so many SEO folks get a cold sweat when someone says single page app? especially if they say it's React, Vue, or Angular. I mean, this actually does apply to me as well. I'm not going to lie. When somebody says to me, "Hey, we've just done this website in React," there is a thing on the back of my head which goes, "Oh, okay, right." And normally it's because what has happened is the developer's gone ahead and built it and then said, "Hey, can you SEO it?" This is the worst possible way in which SEO should be kind of included. It should be a features requirement very early on. So if your developer says at some point, "We're rebuilding the website," start talking to them about whether or not they're going to be using any particular technology like Vue, React, or Angular. Is it going to be a single page app? Are they going to be using progressive web app features? Ask them about how they're going to be building it quite early on to make sure that you don't run into the problems that I'm going to go through. I'm going to whiz through all the kind of common problems and then we'll dissect them one by one. So one of the things I should mention is there's a guy called Barry Adams. Barry Adams is one of the best SEOs out there. And if you follow him on Twitter or any other social media, you see he rants a lot, and with good reason. JavaScript is ruining the web, is one of the things that he said. To be fair, he had a lot of good points, and I often kind of refer back to him as kind of a guy who I would say this is somebody who really knows about SEO. He's been working for some of the biggest newspapers. He knows exactly why things go wrong, exactly why things go right, and he's a true expert on it all. So it's worth listening to this talk. Developers are not often SEO experts. It's kind of surprising in some ways because to me, a lot of basic SEO is very much kind of an understanding how search engines work, how search engines crawl websites, what they're looking for, basic information retrieval. It's all the kind of things that you'd think developers would kind of understand if they were taught a little bit more. So why do they get it so wrong? Well, sometimes they make it just a single page. This means that literally as you scroll down it, it's just one single long page. The contact page, the about us page, the videos, all of it, it's just literally all loaded into one single page, usually with something called parallax scrolling, which makes it look cooler and sexier. But fundamentally, for Google, this isn't a great user kind of experience because for a user, they search for like a particular element within the site, they want to kind of go straight into that page. They don't want to necessarily start at the top and scroll down to halfway down a long page. So from a user point of view, this isn't very good. Not if they wanted to start from a search engine, not land on the top of that single long page. The other problem is sometimes the URL doesn't change. Imagine that you're watching a cool video on a website and you send it to a friend, either on Twitter or however you want to send it, and they've seen something completely different. This is because as you're clicking around, the URL doesn't change. So it is important that we kind of fix that as well. Google needs unique URLs for landing pages. So if you're sharing something for a link or something, Google will only be linking through to a page that it actually has a true URL for. The other problem that we often discover is it's completely untracked. This has happened to me a number of times where I've been looking at somebody's very cool single page application and I've looked at it and said, this is great. That's weird. The bounce rate is like 100% and nobody ever seems to kind of navigate around it. Then you look into it and you realize it's because they've actually got it untracked. So the interactions aren't actually fully tracked. Soft 404s are another big problem, which I'll go into in more depth later on. But basically what happens is because it's all handled client side, the broken links aren't actually loaded up on the server. They're loaded up on via JavaScript. So if you kind of go to a link and it says, actually, we haven't got any content for this, already the server's returned a 200, and that confuses the browsers and search engines and all sorts of different people. So basically, it's very important that the headers are right. JavaScript links, I've mentioned this before, Google can only really read one type of link. I have seen it try to read other type of links, but it can get it completely wrong. There is a near infinite way of writing different links in JavaScript, so it is important that we kind of do get this right. And the final big problem that I kind of consider, or one of the big problems that I've seen, is really heavy code on the first load. This means that despite it being a fast, super cool single page application, that first load is like 5 or 6 megabytes of JavaScript and all sorts of other bits and pieces to load it up. Once it loads up, it's really fast, but it is important that we actually make sure that it loads fast right at the start. Open Graph is quite important as well for a lot of people. If I'm sharing your website on Twitter or Facebook or on WhatsApp or on Slack, It's really important that search engines, social media sites can read like that extra information. Then it can give the cool image, the cool title, all sorts of other bits and pieces. If you don't know about Open Graph, have a look into it. It's really powerful stuff and can really make your website far more shareable when you're kind of sharing it on every single social media platform nowadays. Spider traps are quite a problem as well. A spider trap is where when you're clicking around, it creates a different sort of link, and it can almost create an infinite number of these links. Now, what is interesting is like when you're browsing around these sites as a user, you don't tend to find these spider traps, but search engines and tools will often find these, and you kind of blink and Screaming Frog has found 10,000 URLs on your 100-page website. This is often based on the fact that it's got slightly incorrect slashes or something similar, which the search engines and the tools are finding, but users aren't. So it is important that you actually get this sort of thing right. As I said, testing is absolutely critical. Duplicate content, because the content is dynamically loaded into your page, sometimes Google kind of looks at it, tries to load it up, doesn't quite wait long enough for the JavaScript content to be loaded in and says this page is the same as this page, which is the same as this page, particularly if it's not rendered very well, particularly if it's a little bit slow. We've seen a lot of problems where Google has said, actually, all these pages are the same. We're looking at it kind of going, no, it's not. You're just being a bit impatient, Google. So it is important that you kind of look into and evaluate if Google's seeing duplicate content. The other problem with single page apps is that because the URLs are dynamic, it's often easy to kind of rewrite the URLs in different ways. A dash or an underscore, a trailing slash, case, there's so many different ways. And inconsistent URLs are a big problem. You've got to make sure that the canonical tags, the internal links, the capitalization, the XML sitemap, all of this maps up, and that is really important. One of the things that we have spotted is sometimes you find additional parameters like tracking parameters, UTM parameters, and sometimes these applications will take these tracking parameters and try and pass them through to subsequent pages, particularly via like pagination or hreflang or something like that. And because of this, this causes even more problems. Now, fragments and hashbangs. Google has deprecated fragment-based URLs, but so many developers will find some old documentation on it from 8, 9, 10 years ago. And this is where the URL has a hash and an exclamation mark, and there's some documentation out there saying Google would read these URLs. Developers kind of go, hey, found this documentation, and it works. No XML sitemap, which in the JavaScript apps is more important than ever before, particularly if it's not fully rendered, particularly if the internal linking needs to be discovered by Google rendering the page using its own kind of browser, which is very similar to Chrome, but basically no XML sitemap means it's much slower for it to find all the pages in the website, particularly if the website is pretty huge. So we know the problems. What are the solutions? So we'll go through each one of them fairly slowly, but please shout in the questions if you've got any questions. Sorry, please start. Let me start that again. Ask in the comments if you've got any questions, and we'll discuss them afterwards. So just a single page. That was the first one. Google has got really good documentation on using something called the History API. This means that when you click around, you're using JavaScript to change the URL and also change the back and the forward button. This means that the URL does change. This means that all of the different content be the same URL as what you're seeing. Here's an example. Basically, here's some code which Google has actually provided themselves. It basically says that if you go into it, it says that what happens is it stops the browser from doing the default action, which means that when I click on a link, it doesn't automatically load up that next page. It takes that information and then tries to push it in using the history push state to kind of change the URL, as well as loading up the content into the page. I mentioned before how this kind of works, but basically this code demonstrates how you can change the URL, change the window, change all the information around it without actually reloading the entire web page. Next thing I mentioned is tracking. Now, tracking is actually a really easy thing to fix. The reason I say this is because you've already got some code which says, when you click on this, do this. Just put a little bit more code into it. Says, when you do this and you do this, also track it, fire it into here like this. Now, The reason that this becomes kind of an interesting question, you have to kind of talk to your analytics people about this. What I think is important is to kind of make sure there is a little bit of a strategy here, to kind of make sure that you understand, should it be a new page or is it an interaction? Good example is on that menu, which I mentioned with Just Eat. Would you consider that just a new page view or like an event within it? When they click on a video, when they change a little bit of the page, should it be considered an entire page or just a little bit of it? So is it an event or is it an entire page view? Should it impact the bounce rate? Should it impact the how you track it is kind of important. So it's a conversation that you should have. One of the things I should mention, by the way, GTM is slightly different. You fire the code by pushing things into the data layer, which is a little bit complicated, but after you've kind of got the code into it, it's actually relatively simple. The other thing that's interesting is that within GTM, you actually got built-in variables, which means that you can use the history change as a variable kind of already built into it. So you can actually create triggers based on this. So this actually makes life a lot simpler. So short version is the fact that GTM already has a lot of the tracking built in if you're using that history changing information. Going back to that SPA URLs, quick rant, consistent human readable URLs, always consistent trailing slashes, always consistent case, canonical tags must match, and parameters in indexable pages are not great. One of the clients that I'm working on at the moment, it's filled with hundreds of parameters, and trying to explain that this is challenging for us to kind of go, should this page be crawlable? Should this page not be? If we block it in robots.txt, then it blocks all of that version, not just that one parameter. It's a challenge to make everything completely right, which is why we really want them to be human readable URLs. For instance, you don't have slash page ID equals 1276, you have page slash contact us or something similar to that. It makes life a lot simpler. As I mentioned, soft 404s is the biggest challenge in JavaScript apps. This is the biggest challenge that I've found when I've been talking through with clients about how we have SEO problems. This is because apps are handled at a client-side level, but a 404 is a server-side response. And this really does create a lot of challenges for us when we're trying to kind of get this done. There are ways in which you can use service workers from Cloudflare, if you can use pre-rendering, if you can do all sorts of similar solutions. But sometimes there's some really simple solutions to it. For instance, if you've got a certain pattern type, if it falls outside of a page pattern, then maybe it should be a 404. If it fails to load content in when you're kind of testing it, maybe that should be a 404. It is, like I say, it's quite a challenge, and Google have said that you can just no index the pages, but that does feel to me like a bad solution. So it's a backup rather than a good solution. I don't have a great single answer for this, and I've worked with developers over the years who have kind of given me much better answers. One of the things that you will find is if you go into Google Search Console, if you've got a large website, you will find that a number of pages are being reported by Google as software reports. And this is something I really strongly recommend fixing if you can do. Go in and investigate it. This is one client, and we're basically working with them to kind of try and fix some tiny problems. This, for instance, is where the page is saying there are no products found in the product listing page, for instance, or something similar. This is such a common problem that we are fighting it in almost every single one of our clients in one way or another, unless it's a small site. So there is more information from Google on this, and they have got information on this to avoid soft 404 errors. So, you know, as somebody's asked in the chat, will the slides be available afterwards? I'll make sure they're available. So, as I mentioned before, JavaScript links, Google can only read one type of link, and in JavaScript, there's a near infinite way of writing them. So the good thing is Martin Splitt has written this in detail. It should just be a bog standard ahref equals the URL, and that's it. That's the only type of link that will work. Every other type of link where you've kind of got on clicks or ahref equals JavaScript execute or something like that, Google will not be able to follow those links. So it's very, very important to kind of get this one thing absolutely right. And like I said, Martin Splitt, he's got so many presentations on this. I'm not going to go into all the details. He talks about it far better. He's the Google advocate for JavaScript, so he really does know what he's talking about. It's definitely worth listening to some of his talks, and I learned so much by listening to him. One of the things I learned relatively recently is the fact that Google uses an up-to-date version of Chrome now to kind of browse the websites. And one of the things that we often find is that Google is now executing JavaScript on more and more pages than ever before. So we don't have to kind of panic as much about pre-rendering everything. We don't have to panic about no JavaScript version for everything. We can trust that Google will be executing JavaScript, but we have to make sure it's doing it correctly every time. And as I mentioned, this is the example for Justy. And if we look, when we go into the source code, we have that classic ahref equals menu link. And this is so important because it was very, very important for us to make sure all of the tabs for all of the menu pages were fully crawled, because they're different information for different people. Some of it was for people wanting to order right now, and some people were looking for more information on takeaways. And we wanted to make sure we had the content for everybody. So because we wanted both of these pages to be indexed, and we wanted the user interaction to be very, very efficient, so we used that single page application technology. It was great that the developers did this absolutely perfectly to make sure that the single page application technology worked within it. Okay, so heavy code on first load. Do you know what? I'm not going to go into that one too much. The reason I'm not is because this is something where you just basically have to talk to developers about how to fix it better. It's something where you have to make sure it's Ajax type technology, which means that you're not trying to load 100 pages into one single load. This is something where every developer has to tackle this differently. So let's not go into that one on this talk, because otherwise it will take another 45 minutes. Open Graph. Okay, so with Open Graph, Facebook cannot read JavaScript rendered metadata. I've tested this relatively recently and it still can't do it. I'm surprised actually, because I thought it would. This is not a quick win. You have to make sure that metadata is pre-rendered. So that means that if you find a particular URL, you have to make sure that the metadata on that page absolutely matches the kind of the page content. The metadata for Open Graph can include the big image, or Twitter images, all sorts of other bits and pieces. So it is important that this is got right. Like I mentioned before, one of the things that we are finding is increasingly people are sharing pages in Slack, particularly with lockdown and everything. People are remote working more and more. So if your traffic is coming from Slack, if you make sure that your pages have the Open Graph information on it, the click-through rate will be far, far higher, far, far more important. So it is important that all of this is done correctly. And sadly, it still needs just that plain HTML. So, yep, no quick wins. Open Graph needs to be pre-rendered or basically written into the HTML itself. If there's a magic solution for it, that's amazing. Spider traps. As I mentioned before, spider traps are where Google and other search engine and other tools will basically crawl through the site, and they'll create almost an artificial URL kind of pattern. Sometimes this goes /contact /contact/contact/contact, and it can kind of do this almost infinitely. Calendars are another good example. If you can browse through the calendar, then there is, as you can imagine, almost an infinite number of dates, and search engines will try and kind of browse everything on your website. And sometimes they'll kind of get lost in spider traps rather than finding the great content that you want search engines to find and index. So it's really, really important that you test and test and test. Test your fastest navigation, test your calendars, test all of those bits and pieces. And the way in which I would recommend doing it is doing 2 crawls in Screaming Frog. The first one with JavaScript switched off, and the second one with JavaScript switched on. This means that you're seeing all of the different URLs, and you can compare it using a spreadsheet just to kind of say, hey, we've checked it, we've got consistent linking, we've got consistent everything, there isn't going to be any issues. Make sure that you kind of append a parameter as well. The reason I say this is because often if you appended a parameter on one page, the application and the way in which the JavaScript's written, it'll append it across all of the other pages as well. So you'll find that this tiny issue creates all sorts of links in itself. Another good example is hosts. One website I was working on, for some reason, it linked to dub instead of www, so 2 W's instead of 3 W's, and it would then kind of crawl the entire www version, and for some reason that was rendering the content as well. So if you find that you've got duplicate across hosts, then yeah, make sure you test for all of those kind of random bits and pieces. And like I say, Screaming Frog's your best friend here. There are other tools, of course, on the market, but Screaming Frog's the one that does this one best. By the way, if you're using a laptop and using Screaming Frog, it will heat up your laptop and it will be quite, what's the word for it, power consuming. So expect not to be able to kind of use your laptop too efficiently whilst you're doing a JavaScript crawl. Duplicate content. We've recently discovered one of our clients was finding that Google wasn't pulling in the content into the page. And the reason for this is because when it loaded up, it would load up the page and then it would try and load up the content into the page. And we often found that Google wasn't waiting around quite long enough for this second piece of content to be loaded into the page. What this meant was it said that all of these 2,000 pages were actually the same page, and it had said, we're going to canonicalize it into this one single page. The best way to find this is in Google Search Console. If you have a look at it and it says that we've canonicalized it to a different canonical than the one that you've selected, then that's where it's kind of going wrong. And if it's happening in your website for a rendered application, then often you need to do different fixes. So as I say, tracking parameters, that can cause huge issues because it will basically append itself and it can kind of often flow through it. This doesn't happen in all, of course, so it is important that just a few of them, it happens in, like I say, testing. Testing is all the things that you should be doing. Test it across multiple pages and just go for it. So internal links should always link to the canonical versions. So there are times when this isn't completely true. For instance, if you've got like a parameter to kind of do a filter or something and you don't necessarily want that filter to be indexed, you might have a different canonical for various other reasons, but generally speaking, internal links should always link through to the canonical version of the page. So if you've got a slight difference in the way in which parameters are sort of configured to kind of have multiple variants of the page, then just make sure that your linking is consistent. And the other thing is you should try and always start with HTTPS or the relative to the root of the website. And the reason for this is if you don't have it starting with a slash or a HTTPS, then what can happen is that the search engine will just kind of append it and create those spider traps. Because UTM is on one page, it doesn't need to be on the next page. As I mentioned before, fragments and hash banks. So this is where there's like a hash in the URL, and this can cause all sorts of issues. Now, this actually still works. We were looking at a website very recently and I was surprised because I was sort of saying to people, don't do this, it doesn't work anymore, it's definitely not the right way to do it. And Google has said they're deprecating it in 2015. So the fact that it sort of still works today was actually a bit of a surprise. So if your developer kind of turns around and says, well, we tested it and it works, tell them basically that's great, but it might not work tomorrow. If it doesn't work tomorrow and you've suddenly lost all your traffic, then if you didn't kind of shout out that this was going to be a potential big issue, then this was something that's on you. But if you kind of said, yep, it works, it's fine, go ahead. There are times when I test things and I kind of go, you know what, this works today, let's do it. Some hacks in robots.txt files, some hacks in other places. But if you fundamentally have to rebuild your website because you did something in a particular way and you're losing traffic because you can't redirect it, then that is definitely an issue. One of the things that I would say is that fragments do have a use in SEO. This is for when you kind of jump down the page. Now, I know I talk about Just Eat quite a lot. It's a kind of client that I can talk about, so I kind of do. When we were rebuilding the menu pages for Just Eat, we actually said, oh, well, actually, instead of it having a link down to part 1 of the page or part 2 of the page, why don't we see if we can kind of use named anchors and say, hey, link it to the starters or the desserts or the old classics or the I mean, this was more effective for pages where there's a particularly diverse menu and people wanted something very specific. A great example of this was the milkshakes, because a lot of people wanted milkshakes from one restaurant. So basically being able to jump straight to that was quite important. I don't know how much this is used because Google's removed the tracking from this. At one point you could actually see this in your Google Search Console, but now it's gone. So this was kind of quite interesting. XML sitemaps, fundamentally for all websites, if you've got a 20-page website and your internal linking is really good, an XML sitemap is worth it, but isn't kind of essential. But for a single page app where the content is rendered using JavaScript and there's all sorts of internal link potential issues, XML sitemap is absolutely critical. This is just, all it is a list of pages you want Google to index. So basically, make sure you get it right. I'm going to go through some key points on this. An XML sitemap does not need to be completely comprehensive. By this, I say that, you know, if you've got hundreds of pages on your site and you've only got several hundred that you actually want to be kind of specifically indexed, then You only really need to put those ones in. And the reason I sort of kind of say this is that a lot of our clients have been told by other SEO people, no, it needs to have every single indexable page in there. Well, ideally, yes. Ideally, it should be perfect. But one of the things I would say is we don't live in a perfect world. You can have multiple sitemaps. So if you have one sitemap for one set of pages, one sitemap for another set of pages, you might find that only one set of pages, which comes from a particular database, this one gets updated more regularly than others. And it's much easier to have multiple sitemaps that you kind of update as and when you need to, rather than having one set of sitemap that you can combine everything in. The other reason for this is in Google Search Console, it'll tell you how much a particular sitemap is indexed and how many problems there are. So you can use this as a reference to kind of understand how effective each individual sitemap is and each individual page type is. XML sitemaps should be reasonably up to date. The reason I say reasonably is because often we produce these in a static way. Even when we've got kind of dynamic websites, we often say that they're kind of produced once every couple of days and then they're published to the server rather than dynamically loaded up each time. It's just the way in which a lot of CMSs, a lot of applications work. So it should be reasonably up to date. I would say within days, ideally not months. So question for you, how often does it need to be updated? Can you manually create the XML sitemaps? I mean, this literally does depend on every website you work on. For instance, a lot of websites that I work on, they're not adding new pages. The page content doesn't change. There is no reason why we can't use a manually created XML sitemap that we kind of manually do once every month or so. This isn't the best solution. Every CMS, every kind of platform should do it, but it's sometimes a trade-off. If you've got one developer or two developers and you've got 100 things that you want them to do, producing a static XML sitemap might be down the bottom of the list if you can kind of create one manually yourself. One of the things I would say is don't worry about putting frequency, priority, or last updated in these. And the reason I say that is because Google is ignoring this a lot more than ever before. We often find that when I look in them, the last updated date always says yesterday, and that's just daft. Frequency always says daily, and priority, well, I've never quite understood what people are putting in priority because often it's not appropriate. Priority isn't about how well that page should rank. It's actually about whether or not this page should be re-indexed more frequently. So when you're working on a website, which some pages which are updated very regularly, priority should be high. If it's updated never, then it should be low. T's and C's pages, privacy, all of those kind of pages, you know, priority should be like almost zero. XML sitemaps, internal links, canonical tags must match. I know I've been ranting about this 3 times, but it seems to be a big problem with a lot of the sites that I've looked at. And that's it for single page applications. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of carry on talking a little bit because I'm looking at the time and I've still got a little bit of time left to kind of carry on. So Andrew, shout if I've run out of time at all, but let's kind of crack on.
We're good.
Say again, sorry?
We are good on time.
Perfect. All right, I'll crack on slightly. So I often get asked, which is my favorite JavaScript framework? It's like choose my favorite child. I don't like any of them. But be React to Angular, Vue, it really doesn't matter. What matters is which one is the most suitable for the job. And often this is down to the developer. I find that Angular has more challenges from a pure SEO point of view, but Vue, React, they're pretty much the same almost. Google now uses Chrome and a very up-to-date version of Chrome, not the same one that everybody uses for browsing. There's some very tiny differences, but they're very minor nowadays. At one point, it was stuck on like version 47, and we were like on 84. Don't quote me on those numbers, but basically it was using a very old version of Chrome. Now we're actually in a very comfortable place, so we don't have to kind of worry about it. Basically, if it's working in Chrome effectively, it will work for Google usually. I say usually, test. The downside is the way to test is usually by looking in your Google Search Console and seeing how it works there. The downside to doing that is it can be a little bit out of date when you're doing it at scale. But honestly, if somebody asked me, I'm going to say I'm in Team React. Should you pre-render? It depends. Generally speaking, yes, if you can, and it's so much easier to do pre-rendering on smaller sites. This is where you kind of create a static version and you give that to search engines. You don't necessarily need to give it to all users, but sometimes what you can do is say, if you're a search engine, give them a rendered version, which means that it's in plain HTML. It's not trying to kind of build it on the client side. There are a lot of opportunities for you to do it in a different way, but yeah. So this is basically talking about how it works. Now, one of the things that I should mention is dynamic rendering is not cloaking. Google will tell you this, so you don't have to panic about this. Now, I kind of say this on a repeated way, and the reason I say this repeatedly is because I've heard a lot of developers saying, oh yeah, but if we give Google a slightly different code set to users, then that's cloaking. One interesting thing we did discover is that one client that we investigated, a lot of the content that we were looking at, Google was finding a very different page. Then as we investigated it, we tried rendering it as Google. We tried loading it up using Google Search Console, using the testing tool, and Google was getting a very different version. So they were using dynamic rendering, but it was not up to date. So dynamic rendering is not cloaking, but it must be up to date. Same intent, same everything. The other kind of really cool, sexy thing is progressive web apps. Progressive web apps are fairly, I'm going to say fairly new, but they're quite old now actually. But we've been talking about progressive web apps for about 6-7 years now. This is another sexy TLA, a three-letter acronym. SEOs love TLAs, and basically it's where you can take like your website and turn it into more like an app. A little bit of extra JavaScript and a manifest files means you can actually install your single-page application and make it work offline. Make it feel like a native app. The best example I've got for this is, oops, I've skipped a slide somehow. I'll come back to that. But the other thing that you need is a service worker. So if it's going to work offline, you need to make sure that you use something called a service worker. And this basically is a script that says, separate your web page from your server in such a way that it says that if you kind of click around it, you don't need to revisit the server for this information. Some interactions can be loaded or cached using kind of service workers, which means storage in your browser. This means you can actually install it on your phone and use it offline. Good example of progressive web apps that do this are Tinder, and what was the other one that I had earlier on? There's a coffee one, Starbucks. Starbucks works as a fantastic PWA, and the speed and efficiency of all of this means that it's so much more, the conversion rate from it has gone up significantly. The manifest file that I mentioned, this is simply a almost like a text file written in JSON, and you dump it on your server, usually in the same way you've got like a robots.txt file, and you can say how it starts, how it works, how it looks. You can say whether or not it should load up in the browser or if it should look like a full-blown app. It gives it different applications, even pictures, and there's so many other bits and pieces you can put in it now. You can even put in kind of shortcut actions. So if you click into it on your browser and on your homepage, if you hold it down, you can kind of do an instant action. I'm trying to think of a good example here, but yeah, you can kind of do all sorts of bits and pieces in the same way you can with apps. So apps and progressive web apps are merging quite fast. And the great thing about a progressive web app is you don't have to go through Google Play, you don't have to go through the iOS App Store. But apps, progressive web apps on iOS aren't as powerful as they are on Android devices. So my favorite example is, you can't actually read that because for some reason my bar's not disappearing. But basically this is airhorner.com. And if you go to airhorner.com, it does this very cool thing where, I don't know if you can see me here, but look, oh, where's the camera? Oh, there it is. And it just does this. And that works offline. Very, very powerful. Great little air horn. I've got no real reason for having it except for the fact that I can annoy people with it, and it works offline, but it is just a simple web page. So my final thoughts, yeah, I know, Jerry Springer, final thoughts, bad joke, but right, single page apps, progressive web apps, they're definitely the future. They're often done badly purely because the SEO strategy is missing. It's a kind of an afterthought rather than a kind of built into it. So what happens when a page is removed? How will Google find all the pages? What are the key landing pages? If you want to know more, ask the questions in the chat and ping me at Durgle. That's my Twitter handle. Cool. Okay. Great. Right.
Thanks, Jerry. That was definitely a lot of information to take in. So if you guys are worried, there will be a replay up, and we will send the presentation to you, and you can rewatch everything at your own pace. And right now we have the opportunity to ask Jerry specific questions about his PAs. So let's go ahead and start off with our first one that we have. Let's see. Okay, we have a question from Alex. When I switch different pages or views of my SPA, the URL doesn't change. Does this mean that Google only sees my homepage? And if so, how can I fix this?
Okay, so short version is maybe. So if Google, if you're when you're clicking around, it's not changing the URL. This means that there isn't that JavaScript which changes the history. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that Google can only see your homepage. It depends on whether or not internal linking is working for. So remember I mentioned the fact that there's a link which says, when you click on it, change other bits and pieces. It really does depend. So if you right click on it, open a new tab. Does that change the URL? If that changes the URL, then it works. That's my kind of secret hack.
All right, so I hope Alex will definitely try that out before going. And I also wanted to say, was that Jono Alderson on the Tinder
Oh,
page?
God.
One of the
Yes, it
slides?
was. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the background to that one is the fact that he did a conference presentation once where he was bullying me, and I kind of created a load of page images of him, and I just stole that one for this particular presentation. Yes. I haven't found John Alderson on Tinder. His wife would kill him if he was on it.
All right. Okay, thanks. Let's move on to the next one. So the next question is, I noticed that if I enter the wrong URL for my SPA, the page displays an error as it should. However, the status is 200. Is this a big issue? And how can the situation be resolved? Thanks.
Yeah, this is definitely an issue, and this is one of the issues that I've fought against on so many different websites. The short version is the fact that it is a bit of an issue, but what you can do is you can use a no index in it, and that's what Google are kind of recommending. The way in which the URLs work for spas is kind of often different to the way in which URLs work for classic kind of web pages. So that's why you're getting the 200 response code. Ideally, it shouldn't happen like that. But what you can do is use no index, which is kind of a solution where you use metadata, robots, no index, that kind of thing. But yeah, if you can fix this on the server side, that is far better. Now, the way to fix that server side is you kind of have to understand all of the URLs that will be serving a 200, which means that you need to use something like Cloudflare Workers or something similar on the server side. There are lots of different pre-rendering solutions that will kind of allow you to kind of do this. Yeah, we've investigated different ones for different clients over the years, and it really does depend on what the server's based on, what the app is based on, as to whether or not it's simple.
All right, thank you. And we just want to remind everyone that you can reach out to Gerry via his Twitter handle, and we will definitely mention that in the follow-up emails. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Would an e-commerce SPA be at a disadvantage to go up against traditionally built websites because of the fact that Google does not crawl JavaScript on the first wave?
So this is a great question. And what we have found in the past is we would be much more assertive on this particular question, and basically saying that if you've got a huge, large website, you need that internal linking, and that internal linking needs to be there on that first kind of crawl. So yeah, this is a great question, and the short answer is yes, it would be at a disadvantage. Now, if you can pre-render it to make sure that all of the links and everything else like that's there, then definitely. But if you can't, then it's going to take a little bit longer. The bigger the website, the more of the issue it is. So yeah, pre-rendering is the solution to this particular problem. Pre-rendering at scale is a lot more challenging than it sounds. My personal feeling is that using XML sitemaps and isomorphic JavaScript, which is what somebody else has kind of mentioned there, that is the best solution. If you can kind of put those two together to kind of bring it all in, that means basically that as you're browsing around the website, it's taking advantage of the sort of the SPA technology, but as you're kind of first loading it up, it's kind of using server-side HTML.
All right, great. We actually have a question about isometric JS, the next one. So I hope this Gerry helped Xenia figure out that pre-rendering is the way to go here. Well, one of the ways to go here. So let's move on to the next one from Matthew. I heard that isometric JS might help. Do you think it makes sense to use it with SPAs, and are there specific tools that you would recommend?
Yeah, so isomorphic JavaScript is where you're kind of combining server side and client side, basically. So the website will load up. I mean, the way in which I used to kind of describe this was the fact that a website will kind of load up the bare bones, and then the JavaScript will come in almost like the sauce. It will be almost like the ketchup to like the chips almost. What will happen is basically the bare bones of the website will kind of effectively load up, but then the JavaScript will almost take over to kind of flesh it out, create all of the rest of it. Now, this is definitely the way to go, but it's not necessarily as simple as saying like some tools will kind of fix this, but basically understanding what should be built into the original page load and what needs to be loaded up afterwards. So isomorphic is something that Google were talking about extensively about 3 or 4 years ago. But interestingly, I haven't heard them talk about that as much at sort of conferences, but this is definitely the way in which we're pushing our clients to go.
Yeah, so it's weird that they're not talking about it. So I hope maybe something is cooking and they're coming up with a new update for us or something like that. All right, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. A question we have from Michael. How would you test SEO crawling on a development site before deploying without accidentally indexing your development site?
Yeah, great question. Big problem that we've seen is the fact that trying to crawl some of these sites can be really challenging for a lot of tools. My recommendation is always using Screaming Frog to kind of test all these. But when you're trying to test it as to how well Google can see it, that is a bit more of a challenge. So we often actually use kind of an area of the main site where we kind of say, actually, let's have a look and let Google kind of take a look at these half a dozen pages. We sometimes even have test development sites which are exclusively used for testing kind of, can Google see it? Can Google crawl it? Can Google understand it? But we just have completely different content on it. Just Eat, we had a kind of tiny microsite at one point where we kind of tested some of the single page application technologies, some of the page designs and other bits and pieces, but it didn't have the same content as the main site. And you know, if somebody found it, all they would have found would be like a site on dogs or something weird like that. So that's a great question. For the original part of it, if you've got like a large development site which is like a mirror of the main site, use Screaming Frog to kind of check all of the internal linking, all of the whether or not the pages can be rendered, the content from it. Screaming Frog has a JavaScript enabled option in the premium version, and that is the way which we've always done it. To test Google, as I say, we did a kind of site which was just a very random, weird stuff that we kind of let Google index, and we knew that it would never kind of go, actually, this is part of the main site. And if anybody found it, it would just be kind of like weird stuff anyway.
All right, thank you. We have a similar question. How do you test if Google is able to read your website in JS? Is this your friend actually from Canada? Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you test the pre-render to see if it is working?
She should know this. She's been working on a JavaScript website for years. So the short version is the fact that you can use the test and render feature in Google Search Console. So basically, if you go into Google Search Console, what you can then do is go and basically use right along the top, there's like inspect any URL, take the page, put it in there, and then see what comes out of it. There's like a tab on the side of it where it says, what does this page really look like? And from there, you can see whether or not it's kind of rendered, what the HTML looks like. It's a very effective way of doing it. And I do this a lot on every single website I'm working on. It's one of the best ways in which you can audit a website, even if it's not a single page app.
Great, thanks, and thank you guys for all your questions. I'm not finishing right now, but I just wanted to say thank you for contributing. Let's move on to the next one. We have a question from Diana. I'm struggling to understand the difference between client-side rendering, server-side rendering, and pre-rendering. Plus, what type of rendering would you recommend for different types of websites?
Okay, so client-side rendering is where when you view source, the HTML is different to when you right-click and inspect it. So if you right-click and inspect it in Chrome and look at the HTML, the kind of the code there, if that looks very, very different to the HTML when you view source, that means that it's kind of client-side rendered. When it's server-side rendered, the two look very, very similar. Pre-rendering is where it's the same as kind of server-side rendering, but often where you pre-render it, it's not as dynamic and updated. So what can happen is we will sometimes pre-render a page or pre-render a site to say, when the search engine comes along, or when Twitter or Facebook or or some other service comes along, we show it kind of a static version of the JavaScript, the rendered code, which is a lot less always up to date and maybe not as effective as the JavaScript only version. What type of rendering would I recommend? So this is kind of one of those things where I kind of work with developers very closely, and I kind of say to them, like, what do you recommend for different pages? So the reason I sort of say this is the fact that a lot of the time, the reason that we use client-side rendering, the reason we use different types of rendering is because there's a technical requirement. For instance, does it need to be dynamic? Does it need to be personalized? Does it need to be up to date? I mean, classic HTML is nearly always the best way to go for like that first load. So the less JavaScript that's required on that first load to kind of display the page, the better. But then subsequently, as you're browsing around, that's when the single page application technology really comes into its own and creates a better kind of user experience.
Thank you, Gerry. Once again, I think this is the last question, but in case we have another one come in during your answer, we will address that as well. So let's move on to the next one. Which JavaScript framework should I choose for a web app that will be optimized for search engines? Can't decide between Vue Next, React Next, and Angular Universal.
It doesn't matter. Well, I say that basically. Normally, it's dependent on the developer, whichever developer is best. Now, I would say React is the fastest, but Vue is also quite fast. Angular used to be the kind of the cool one, but nowadays it almost doesn't matter. And the reason I say it almost doesn't matter is the fact that basically different ones are better for different purposes. My view is generally React's the best, but React is generally better if you're using Microsoft technology. Vue, I think, is better for different people. It's almost what's your backend built on, what's your server built on, what kind of works for your developers, what's your skill set. The difference between React and Vue is minor. Vue Next, I mean, that is actually better for sort of pre-rendering. So for search engines, Vue Next is pretty good. React Next is also very good. So it kind of doesn't matter. I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but basically what I would say is which one is the best for the user, which one is the fastest, which one is the best when it's kind of rendered and engaged with. Like I say, search engines can use all of this. There's pre-rendering available for Vue, React. Angular, I'm not as sure about the pre-rendering services. So yeah, it very much does depend.
All right, Gerry, thank you. I think everybody who wanted to ask a question did so. I want to thank Gerry for joining us today and being our expert on the topic of single page applications. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions. So just remember that everything will be up on YouTube, and we will have a recording and the presentation sent to your inbox. And make sure to reach out to Gerry at Dergal if you have any additional questions, and we will take the discussion from there. So I think we're going to end it here, Gerry. Thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you for your time.
Hope to do this again in the future. Take care, guys. Bye.